is very good to see all of you here. We had a great turnout. The first service, as Austin mentioned, so good to see you. Adding to that, before we jump in, I want to say a couple of thank yous. First, in the first service, Marilyn Barnes and Ellen McKinley were here, and I wanted to thank them and Miss Anita Bowman for putting together the women's retreat yesterday. Hopefully, some of you got to participate. Had a huge turnout, a lot of pictures floating around. So if you see Anita after the service, make sure that you pat her on the back and thank her for what she did. Also, last weekend we talked about the idea of volunteering and finding a place to serve, and had a huge response to that, over 30 now. So if somebody hasn't followed up with you yet, just let me know. I'll be up here when the service is over. But there's a lot of things that have to be done in terms of scheduling and background checks for certain areas and all that sort of stuff. So we're working on it. Glad we'll get you plugged in wherever you need to be plugged in just as quickly as we can. And just so you know, that window has not closed yet. So if you spent all week thinking, I should have turned that in, you can still turn it in. In fact, we had a couple of ladies after the first service that gave me their forms. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you have your Bible with you or your phone, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20. When you hear the word leader, who or what is it that comes into your mind? If you're a business person, maybe you think about a visionary CEO like Elon Musk or Tim Cook, somebody who can navigate the world of big business while at the same time creating these products that stretch the limit of imagination. Or maybe you think in terms of some political leader. Maybe Winston Churchill or Abraham Lincoln comes to your mind. Somebody that knew how to pull the levers of power, to rally people and somehow change the course of history. If you're a sports fan, maybe you think of somebody like Nick Saban or Adolph Rupp, somebody who was able to develop players and build a team and ultimately win championships. In my world, I often think about Wayne Smith. Wayne preached at Southland Christian in Lexington for 40 years, but he did a lot more than he really inspired an entire movement of people. I was thinking about this on Friday. Wayne retired from Southland in 1995, which is a long time ago now. And yet even today, if you go to a meeting of ministry leaders, somebody will quote something he used to say or tell one of his jokes. I had a meeting Friday. Right at the end, this guy handed me a stack of papers that used to belong to Wayne. And even though he's been gone now for a while, it's like he's still leading. And all of us have somebody that we think of when we think about a great leader. Even if you don't know them personally, there's somebody that you've identified as having certain skills or a certain presence about them that sets them apart. They're the kind of people, they know how to make decisions. They know how to rally the troops and inspire people and accomplish what seems like it would be impossible. Now I have another question that I want you to think about. What is the word that comes into your mind when you look in the mirror? Now, I know enough about me, and I think I know enough about human nature to know that for a lot of us here, the word that comes in our mind would probably be something negative. And I'm not going to go through the list because you probably have your own list of things. But what's happened is a lot of us, we look in the mirror and we see this person and we know the hang-ups, we know the wrong turns, we know the deficiencies. And so we think this person really doesn't have a whole lot to offer. And the last word that would come to most people's minds whenever we think about what we see when we look in the mirror would be the word leader. And so if you were to look in the mirror, you'd go through a long list of words before you ever got to the word leader. And yet, if you're a follower of Jesus, the Scripture makes it clear that you've been called to be a leader. Matthew chapter 20, this morning we're continuing our series that we're calling We Are FCC, and we're talking about who we are as a church, and more importantly, who we hope to be in the future. And last weekend, we focused on the idea that if you're a follower of Jesus, that means you've been called to be a servant, to use your gifts, to serve His kingdom and make things better for the people around you. Today, I want to take that a step further and talk about the idea that you're not just a servant, but you're also a leader. And before you object to that, I want to define what I mean by the word leader. Now, if you look online, you're going to see a million different definitions of what leadership is. But for our purposes this morning, I just want you to think about one simple phrase, and it goes like this: leadership is influence. That's what leadership really is. When you strip away everything else, when you strip away the job titles, the positions, the perks, the responsibilities, leadership is really nothing more than one person exerting influence over another person. So that means if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're an aunt or an uncle, if you teach, if you volunteer, if you work with other people, or even if you just live around other people, if you interact with other people on a regular basis almost at any level, that means you're exerting some level of influence, and that makes you a leader. The question then becomes, how are you leading? How are you using whatever influence you've been given to make things better for the people around you? If I asked you to make a list of great leaders from history, most of us would get pretty far down the list before we ever came up with the name of Jesus. And yet, from a purely historical perspective, it's clear that Jesus is the greatest leader that ever lived. He never held a political office. He never commanded an army. And yet, he's influenced more people throughout history than anybody else you could think of. I mean, just think about all the people that have claimed to follow him. And then you think about the schools, the churches, the hospitals, the nonprofits that have all been started in his name. And then you think about his influence over our laws, our music, our art, our customs, and even the way we tell time. I mean, it's no accident that all over the world today, people identify the date in reference to his birth, either BC or AD. Even people that don't believe in God. So think about this. Every time an atheist writes the date on a check, or every time they look at the byline on a newspaper, what are they doing? They're acknowledging that Jesus had incredible influence over the world, so much so that we even determine what year it is based on his birth. Nobody in history has come close to influencing more people in as many different ways as Jesus. And yet most of the time we think about great leaders, we just sort of skip right over him. But what I want you to think about today is what if it wasn't that way? What if instead of looking to business leaders and coaches and political leaders as our example of what leadership looks like, we instead followed the example of the greatest leader that ever lived? Matthew chapter 20, what you find is Jesus, one of the few places in Scripture where he articulates what leadership is supposed to look like. Most of the time, he was just content to sort of model it for us, but in Matthew 20, he pulls everybody to the side and he gives us a clear summary and explains what leadership is supposed to look like. And what makes it so special is that what happens right before he does it. So if you have your Bible open to Matthew chapter 20, we're going to start in verse 17. It says, now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. I'm going to stop right there for just a second and point out to you that there's a huge transition that takes place in Matthew's gospel at this point, because everything, as you know Jesus' story, everything leads toward Jerusalem and the fact that that's the place where his earthly life will come to an end. And so as he turns his attention from where he's been to where he's going, from this point forward, they will slowly and methodically make their way to the place where his life will come to an end. And it's because Jesus knows that everything that comes after this moment takes on an added importance. When you know the end is getting closer, you cut through the frivolous and you focus on the essential. That's exactly what Jesus is doing. So go back to verse 17. Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, and on the way he took the 12 aside and said to them, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he'll be raised to life. Now, if you read through the gospel, especially Matthew, this is the third time that Jesus has predicted with remarkable precision exactly what's going to happen once he gets in Jerusalem. He knows he's going to be arrested. He knows he's going to have this fake trial. He's going to be mocked. He's going to be flogged. And ultimately, he's going to be crucified. So over and over again, he pulls his disciples aside and he says, hey, here's where we're going. And when we get there, here's exactly what's going to happen. And yet, somehow, they keep missing it. It's like it goes over their heads. Maybe it goes in one ear and out the other. But they have no concept of what's about to happen, even though Jesus has repeatedly warned them. That's what makes what happens next so incredible. Check out verse 20. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. What is it you want, he asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your kingdom. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink? We can, they answered. And Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. I'm trying to imagine this moment. Here's Jesus, and he's just finished telling them, hey, we're going to go to Jerusalem, and they're going to kill me. And almost as soon as the words escape his mouth, here come two of his closest friends, part of his inner circle, James and John. And not only do they come to ask him this question, they bring their mother with them. There's some evidence in the New Testament that James and John might have been cousins of Jesus, which would have made their mother his aunt. You ever had an aunt that didn't mind to put you on the spot? Is she here? No, don't look at her if she's here. But this is how it works. Here comes his two cousins, and here comes his aunt, and she's asking him a question, but she's really not asking. She's trying to tell him, hey, you need to take care of these two guys that have been with you. You need to take care of your family. I mean, here's Jesus. He's just finished talking about his death, and here come these people that should be looking out for him, and it's like they have no concept of what he's just said. Somehow in their minds, they're convinced that as they make their way toward Jerusalem, that they're heading toward an inauguration. They think Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to defeat the Romans, he's going to claim the throne, he's going to put together his royal cabinet, and they want to be in on it. They know they can't be the king, but if they can't be the king, maybe they can be like the prime minister and the secretary of state. They want to be numbers 2 and 3 if they can't be number 1. And just so Jesus doesn't turn them down, they bring along their mom for some added pressure. But Jesus doesn't cave to the pressure, and instead he takes one more opportunity to remind them that what they're heading toward is not an inauguration, but instead it will be an execution. Now check out what happens in verse 24. Because when you get to verse 24, the other 10 guys, these guys that have been with Jesus, realize what's happened. And look at their response. Verse 24, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Now that word indignant, it sounds sophisticated, but it really just means they were really angry. And the reason they were really angry is not because James and John went behind their back and asked Jesus to promote them to that next level of leadership. The reason they're angry is because they didn't think of it first. See, one of the things you learn as you read through the New Testament, the inner working of the disciples, they were always competing with one another for those top spots. They always wanted to know, where do I measure up in relation to the people around me? And they know that if Jesus says yes to James and John, then by definition, he'll be saying no to them. And they'll move a little further down the organizational chart, and nobody wants that. So from that moment forward, you have this situation now where everybody's competing against everybody else for the top spot, and nobody wants to come in second. And so Jesus sees what's happening, and he takes this opportunity to explain something to them that they should have already known. Check out verse 25. Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. In verse 25, with just a handful of carefully chosen words, Jesus summarizes the way that most people throughout history and most people in our culture have thought when they think about leadership. And to do that, he uses these two phrases. The first one is, he says, they lord it over them. And the second one is, they exercise authority. If you look at this in the Greek, both those phrases start with the same compound word. And it's a word that carries with it the idea of pushing others down. So I exercise authority, and I lord authority over people by pushing them down in order to elevate myself. And that's the way historically, and even today, that a lot of people think about leadership. They think leadership is, I push the people around me down so that I can lift myself up. If you wanted to use a diagram to illustrate this mindset, it would go something like this. We're going to put it on the screen. At the top of the pyramid, there's you. And below you is everybody else. And just make sure you understand that everybody else includes everybody else. Your coworkers, your classmates, your teammates, your neighbors, your brothers and sisters, your family members, your children. I mean, you're at the top of the ladder, and everybody else comes in below you. And that's the way a lot of people think about leadership. And if that's my view of leadership, that means that I'm going to work overtime to protect my position at the top. And if that means I have to push the people around me down in order to stay on top, it's nothing personal, but the most important thing is that I stay on top. More than anything else, leadership is about me maintaining my position and holding on to power. Now, I don't have to tell you, because you already know. That's the mindset that has almost ruined our political system. That's the same mindset that's corrupted our corporate world and even our financial world. Some of you work in environments in which that's the way of thinking that dominates. So rather than working together to do what's best, maybe you're surrounded by people whose primary concern is not what's best for us, but it's what's best for me. And so they cast blame and they steal credit and they do whatever it takes to make themselves look better, even if that means they have to push other people down in order to make themselves look better. And maybe the worst thing of all is that that's the way a lot of people think you're supposed to lead. To them, it's all about power and position and the title. But then you get to verse 26, and Jesus points out that there's a better way to think about leadership. I love the way he says it. He says, not so with you. That may be what everybody else does. That may be what everybody throughout history has done, but you don't do it that way. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. It'd be hard to come up with something that would be more countercultural than what Jesus says when he explains what leadership is supposed to look like. And what he's doing here is he's flipping that pyramid that we looked at a second ago. So from Jesus' perspective, it looks different. I want you to look at it on the screen. Rather than you being at the top, you put yourself at the bottom, and you put everybody else above yourself. So your job becomes not to push them down, but to lift them up. Your job is not to maintain your status at the top of the mountain by pushing everybody else off the mountain. Your job is to hold up the mountain and help other people climb to the top. So rather than working hard to push others down, the job of the leader is to find ways to make things better for the people they're leading. Rather than using my position to serve myself, my job as a leader is to use my position to serve the people around me. And just imagine for a second how different our world would be if that's the way most people thought about leadership. Imagine how different your work environment would be. Imagine if your boss came in tomorrow and said, hey, instead of you all working hard to please me, I'm going to work hard this week to serve you. You think that would make a difference? Imagine how different our political system would be. If everybody that entered office decided, you know what, instead of having the people serve me, I'm going to use my position to make things better for the people I'm leading. Imagine how much better things at your house would be if everybody that lived there said, you know what, from this moment forward, I'm going to use whatever influence, whatever skills, whatever talents I have, not to make things better for me, but to make things better for the other people that live here. Do you think it would make any difference? The question is, how do you become that kind of leader? If you look at what Jesus said, there are three things that he draws to the forefront that you need to do if you want to learn to lead like he led. Here's the first one. If you want to lead like Jesus, you have to learn to lead with humility. You have to learn to lead with humility. Jesus said, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. If I handed you a piece of paper and I said, I want you to write down the one thing that you think every leader has to have, every great leader, the one skill they have to have, I don't know what you'd write down, but I could pretty much put together the list because it comes from the way most people in our world think about leadership. So you might say a great leader has to have intelligence. They have to be able to process information and make good decisions. Other people say a great leader has to be a visionary. They have to have a vision. They have to be able to see the future and help inspire people to follow that future. Then you might say things like courage, confidence, communication skills. I mean, we've all got this list of things that we think defines great leadership. And most of the time, whenever we think of a great leader, we think of some of those people I mentioned earlier, somebody with a huge personality, just sort of takes over the room, and they've got all the answers, and you know what I'm talking about. But that's really not true. In fact, that's never been true. Got a picture I want to show you. This is Jim Collins. He's a researcher from Stanford. And several years ago, he led a multi-year research project in which he and a team of graduate students went back and they analyzed the data from 40 years of financial information from over 1,000 companies, 1,435 different companies. And their goal was they wanted to identify, here are the good companies, here are the poor performers, but what about the truly great companies? What is it that separates them? What is it that moves a company from just being good to being great? And of course, of their research, they took a lot of things into account, but the one thing they looked at was, over this 40-year period, are there certain companies that have had a financial performance that is multiples higher than the market average? So in other words, they've outperformed all of their peers. And of the 1,435 companies, they identified 11 that over that 40-year period had done remarkably better than almost all of their competitors. So they started to dig into the data a little more and ask the question, what is it that separates these 11 companies from these 1,400 other companies? And at the end of the day, they identified one thing, and what it was is they called it the presence of a level 5 leader. And so they started to investigate and interview people and talk about what is it that separates the leaders of these 11 companies from all of their peers. And here's what they discovered. It's none of the stuff that we obsess over. It's not charisma. It's not courage. It's not communication skills. It's not even intelligence. The one thing they found that separates those high-performing leaders from all of their peers was their own level of personal humility. I want you to listen to the way Jim Collins said this in his book. He said, level 5 leaders embody a paradoxical mix of personal humility and professional will. They are ambitious for sure, but ambitious first and foremost for the company and not for themselves. In the highest performing companies of the last 4 decades, they were all led by people who had learned to flip that pyramid. It was no longer about them. It was about using their position to serve the people they were leading. The Apostle Paul said the same thing, Philippians 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. You put yourself at the bottom and you put everybody else on top. And Paul said that the way you measure real leadership is you don't look at how the leader's doing, because that's not the standard. You look at how the people they're leading are doing. Now that brings me to the second thing. If you want to learn to lead like Jesus, you have to learn to lead through service. Jesus said, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. I like that phrase. Whoever wants to be first. Well, you know who that is? That's everybody, because everybody wants to be first. Everybody wants to be the team captain, the first-round draft pick, the CEO, the principal, the head coach, the manager, the king, the queen, the president. Everybody wants to be first on the ladder. And most of the time, we think that the way we get there is by scratching and clawing our way to the top. And if we have to pull others down and push them down to keep them there so that we can get to the top, again, it's nothing personal. That's just how it works. That's the world the disciples lived in. It's also the world that you and I live in. But if you look closely at what Jesus said in verse 26, you'll see that he attempts to turn that kind of thinking up on its head when he says that the path to greatness, or the road to the top of the mountain, the road to being number one, is the road of service. And he uses the example of a slave. In Greek, it's the word doulos, and it describes a person who's devoted to serving someone else, even at the expense of their own interest. And I know it's uncomfortable to think about, but that's what a slave does. A slave's job is to serve the interest of their master, even above their own interest. And Jesus said it's that kind of service that values others above yourself that leads to true greatness. And again, he's flipping that pyramid to where you voluntarily place yourself at the bottom so that you can help everybody else get to the top. Now, here's the third thing you see in this passage. If you want to learn to lead like Jesus, you have to learn to lead by giving. When you get to verse 28, Jesus goes back to the subject that had prompted this whole conversation in the first place. when he says, just as the Son of Man, talking about himself, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. David tried this earlier. I'm going to be honest. I was kind of embarrassed for you. So I'm going to have you say that word with me again, all right? 1, 2, 3. Ransom. We can do way better than that. 1, 2, 3. Ransom. There we go. That's what we want. A ransom was this cost that was paid to free a slave. In our culture, you might think about somebody that's been kidnapped. The kidnapper holds them in custody and says, not until you pay this ransom or this fee is this person going to receive their freedom. And Jesus says that all of us have been held in custody. We're powerless to break free from sin. So he goes to the cross and he takes the penalty that we deserve, and his earthly life ends so that we can experience eternal life. And in doing so, he becomes the model that we're supposed to follow. Jesus puts himself at the bottom of the pyramid so that he can elevate the rest of us so that we can experience life as it was meant to be experienced. Now, if you're like me, you read that or you hear that, and you think, well, okay, I understand that, right? I mean, I agree with that. I'm sure that's a good thing to do. But you're talking about, you're talking about Jesus, and I'm not Jesus. In fact, I'm nowhere close to Jesus. So how could you expect somebody like me with as many bad habits, as many wrong turns, how could you expect somebody like me to be anything like Jesus? It's a good question. And the answer to that question is another question that you can learn to ask in every situation that'll help you make better decisions about how you lead and how you influence people. I'm calling it the key question because I think it's the key that unlocks the door for a better life for you and a better life for the people around you. And here's the question. How can I help? That's the question that you should be asking in every situation. When you go to work tomorrow, that should be the question you're asking. When you go to school tomorrow, you're surrounded by your classmates or your coworkers or whatever, that should be the question that you're asking. When you drive through your neighborhood after the end of another long day and you see those neighbors out and they're doing whatever it is they do, that should be the question that's always in the back of your mind. When you come to church on the weekend, when you're hanging out with your kids, when you're hanging out with people you hang out with, and somebody's talking about, the latest drama that's in their life, that should always be the question that you keep returning back to. How can I help? What can I do to make things better? And if you'll just ask that question, if you can somehow identify the answer, and then you just do that thing. Maybe you can't solve the problem. Maybe you can't do everything, but you can at least do the next thing. And if you'll just keep asking the question, identifying the answer, and then doing whatever that next thing is to make things better, over time you'll become a person of more and more influence. You'll become a person that people are drawn to because you'll use whatever gifts and abilities that you've been given to make things better for them. In short, you'll do exactly what Jesus talked about, and you'll be a leader. Now, I've got another picture I want to show you. This is Mary Peters. You probably don't recognize her, but on October 17th, 2006, she was sworn in as the 15th United States Secretary of Transportation. It's only the second woman in history to ever hold that job. And in that role, she was responsible for overseeing all of the public transportation programs in the entire country. At the same time, she oversaw a lot of the infrastructure. I know we've heard a lot about that. So things like roads and bridges and even the airlines, any kind of commercial travel, railroads, all of that was under her purview. At the same time, she was tasked with overseeing a staff of 60,000 employees. Imagine what that would be like, 60,000 employees, and a budget of just over $72 billion. And during her time in Washington, by all accounts, she excelled in that role. One of the few people that received praise from leaders of both parties. When her time in Washington came to an end, she returned home to Arizona. And in 2009, political commentators from her home state of Arizona predicted and identified her to be the heavy favorite to become the next governor of the state. But she decided at the last minute not to run. And today, she serves as a consultant for a company that's developing what's called a bullet train. It's this idea it'll take you from New York City to Washington, D.C. in less than an hour. She's still a major force in the transportation industry and in the world of public policy, even though she's in her mid-70s today. The other thing to know about Mary Peters is that for nearly 40 years, she's been a faithful member of Christ Church of the Valley just outside Phoenix. It's the largest Christian church in America, part of the same movement that we're a part of. The average before COVID, 35,000 people every weekend. Can you imagine trying to fight for a parking spot with 35,000 people? But she's been a long-time member there, but she's not just somebody who shows up, occasionally when she's in town. She's somebody that actually volunteers there. She has served there for several decades. So let's think about this now. Where would you think somebody with Mary Peters' resume, where would you think they would be most valuable to the church? So let's think about this. Christ Church of the Valley has a full-time staff of almost 600 people. So if you put her on the personnel team, she manages company, this part of the government with 60,000 employees. 600 wouldn't be any big deal to her. She'd probably be pretty good at that. Or maybe the finance team. CCV's a huge church, got a huge budget, but nothing like $72 billion. So if you put her on the finance team, I don't think she'd be intimidated by that. I'm sure she'd probably do a pretty good job. At the very least, you could put her on the facilities team. Here's a lady that oversaw the infrastructure of the United States. She's been involved in things a lot bigger than anything goes on at a church campus. So you think, at the very least, she could at least be on that team. And you could put her in any one of those places or any number of other places, and you think, that would be a great addition to the team. But in a recent interview with her preacher, Ashley Woolridge, she explained how 40 years ago, she showed up at a service, and she decided then that she was going to volunteer in her church's children's ministry. And so for 40 years, every weekend she's there, which is most weekends, she goes back in the children's ministry and she teaches a class full of 20 to 25 2-year-olds. That's what she does. And I want you to listen to the comments she made to her preacher as she explained her decision. She said, a lot of people say that if you do this, you're going to make a sacrifice, but no. This is an opportunity to see these kids, love on these kids, and help make the parents comfortable. They come to drop their kids off, and that little one may be crying and screaming and doesn't want to come in there, and you have to stay with them. But it makes your heart feel good because you're doing what you need to do to help everyone at this church. Now, you listen to that, you got to keep in mind, this is a lady that sat in the Oval Office at least once a week for 4 years. This is a lady that made decisions that affects every single person that lives in the United States. This is a lady that even today negotiates billion-dollar deals. And you say, why would somebody like that serve in the 2-year-old department at their church? Here's what Jesus said. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. When you hear the word leader, what is it that comes in your mind? Or maybe a better question is, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see somebody who's trying to get to the top, and in order to do that, they're willing to pull and push others down to elevate themselves? Or do you see somebody that's learned to flip that pyramid? They're using whatever influence, whatever abilities, whatever position you've been given, not to elevate yourself, but to serve the people around you and make things better. Imagine just for a minute how different your life would be if you just decided from this moment forward, that's what I'm going to do. Imagine how different your work environment would be. Imagine how different your house would be. Imagine how different our church would be and our community could be if all of us just decided, hey, that's what we're going to do. We're going to become people that are known for putting the needs of others above ourselves. And I want you to know that can happen. But just like we talked about last weekend, for us to do that, that means that you've got to do that and I've got to do that. Because the we is us. And if we're ever going to become the church that God is calling us to be, then we've got to become the people that God is calling us to be. And that starts with learning to lead with humility and use whatever influence we have to make things better for the people around us. I want you to stand with me. One thing I know for sure is that leading always starts with following. And some of you are here and you may not be a follower of Jesus, and maybe you're ready to make that decision. Others of you may be here and you've been thinking about it and you've been praying about it. Now you're ready to join the team here at First Christian. You know, we'd love to have you. Or maybe you just want to pray with somebody. Maybe you still got questions. You got a need. Dave and I will be here. All you need to do, if you want to talk to one of us, you want us to pray with you, just come down on one of these front rows and we'd be glad to meet with you.